On a crisp autumn morning in the small town of Millbrook, Officer James Thompson started his patrol shift like any other day. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the streets in shades of gold and crimson. 20 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about that morning felt different. As he cruised down Oak Street, he noticed a black SUV with slightly tinted windows rolling through a stop sign. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights and initiated a traffic stop. The SUV pulled over smoothly into an empty parking lot, but Thompson's hand instinctively rested on his holster, a habit formed from years of experience. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a well-dressed black man in his 50s. Before the man could speak, Thompson's voice carried an edge of authority that had become second nature. "License and registration," he demanded, his flashlight beam cutting through the morning shadows. "Of course, officer," the man replied calmly, reaching for his wallet. Something about his composure irritated Thompson. In his mind, people who broke traffic laws should show more nervousness, more respect for the badge. "Step out of the vehicle," Thompson ordered, his voice growing harder. The man's eyebrows raised slightly, but he complied without protest. As he emerged from the SUV, Thompson noticed his perfectly tailored suit and polished shoes, not the usual attire for this working-class neighborhood. "Sir, I was barely rolling through that stop sign," the man began, his voice steady and educated. "I'm actually running late for an important meeting at—" "Hands where I can see them," Thompson interrupted, his grip tightening on his flashlight. The morning sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the parking lot. A few early morning shoppers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. The man's dignity seemed to fuel Thompson's suspicion. Every polite word, every calm gesture only convinced the officer that something wasn't right. In his 2 decades of experience, he'd learned that criminals often hide behind suits and smooth talk. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," the man said, maintaining his composure even as Thompson moved closer, his body language increasingly aggressive. "If you'd just let me explain." "Down on your knees," Thompson barked, his free hand moving to his radio. The man's eyes widened in disbelief, but he slowly began to kneel, his expensive suit pants pressing against the rough asphalt. A small crowd had gathered now, several people with phones raised, recording the scene. Thompson barely noticed them, focused entirely on the man before him. In his mind, the story was already written, another suspicious character in the wrong neighborhood, probably up to no good. What Thompson didn't know was that his body camera was recording every moment, every word, every gesture. He couldn't see the police chief's car turning the corner, drawn by the growing crowd. And he had no idea that the man kneeling before him had just won a historic election, making headlines across the state. The morning sun continued to rise over Millbrook, illuminating a scene that would soon shake the small town to its core. Officer Thompson's world was about to change forever, but for now, he stood firm in his conviction, unaware that his next actions would trigger a chain of events that nobody in the quiet town could have predicted. In the distance, sirens began to wail, their sound growing closer with each passing second. The gathered crowd murmured and shifted, their phones still recording, as the story of Officer Thompson and the man in the suit began to unfold in ways that would challenge everything both men thought they knew about justice, prejudice, and the power of truth. Police Chief Robert Wilson slammed his car door shut, his heart racing as he recognized the man kneeling in the parking lot. Just yesterday, they had shared a coffee while discussing plans for community policing reforms. Now, here was the newly elected mayor of Millbrook, their first black mayor in the town's 150-year history, being treated like a common criminal. "Stand down, Thompson." Chief Wilson's voice boomed across the parking lot. Officer Thompson's head snapped around, confusion flickering across his face as his superior officer strode toward them. The gathering crowd parted like a curtain, phones still recording every moment of the unfolding drama. "Chief, I've got a suspicious," Thompson began, but Wilson cut him off with a sharp gesture. "That suspicious person is Mayor Richardson," Wilson said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Our newly elected mayor." The color drained from Thompson's face as the reality of the situation crashed over him. His hand, still resting on his holster, suddenly felt heavy as lead. The mayor slowly rose to his feet, brushing dust from his suit pants with dignity that made Thompson's stomach churn. "Chief Wilson," Mayor Richardson nodded, his composure intact despite the humiliation he'd just endured. "I was actually on my way to our meeting about the new community center when Officer Thompson stopped me." The crowd had grown larger now, their whispers building into a steady murmur. Someone in the back shouted, "Shame," while others began to press closer, their phones capturing every word, every gesture of this historic confrontation. Thompson's mind raced through his 20 years on the force. How many other times had he let his prejudices cloud his judgment? How many other innocent people had he treated with unwarranted suspicion? The weight of these questions seemed to physically push him back a step. "Officer Thompson," Chief Wilson's voice cut through his thoughts, "return to the station immediately. We'll discuss this incident in detail." The chief's words carried the weight of 2 decades of friendship, now strained by this morning's events. As Thompson turned to leave, Mayor Richardson's voice stopped him. "Officer." Thompson froze but couldn't bring himself to meet the mayor's eyes. "I'd like to speak with you privately tomorrow. Not as the mayor, but as a citizen of Millbrook. I think we both have something to learn from this." The crowd's murmuring grew louder at this unexpected turn. Chief Wilson's eyebrows shot up in surprise, while Thompson finally looked at the mayor, really looked at him for the first time. The anger he expected to see wasn't there. Instead, he found something more unsettling, understanding. Back at the station, Thompson sat alone in the locker room, his badge feeling heavier than ever before. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing, news of the incident had already spread through social media like wildfire. In his office, Chief Wilson reviewed the body camera footage with a heavy heart. The video showed more than just a traffic stop gone wrong, it revealed the subtle biases that could poison even a veteran officer's judgment. As he watched, he remembered his own early days on the force, the mistakes he'd made, and the lessons he'd learned. Meanwhile, Mayor Richardson sat in his office at City Hall, his inauguration photo still leaning against the wall, waiting to be hung. His phone was flooded with messages of support and outrage, but his mind was on something else. He was thinking about his teenage son, who would soon be old enough to drive, and the conversation they would need to have, the same conversation his father had with him decades ago. As the day wore on, the incident became more than just a viral video or a local scandal. It sparked conversations in homes, schools, and businesses across Millbrook. Long-ignored tensions rose to the surface, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about their community. Officer Thompson's drive home that evening was the longest of his life. Every traffic light seemed to hold him in judgment, every pedestrian's glance felt like an accusation. But somewhere between the shame and regret, a small voice in his head wondered if this could be more than just an end, if it could be a beginning. The sun set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the town's historic buildings and quiet streets. In homes across the community, families gathered around dinner tables and television screens, watching the footage that would change their town forever. But the real story, the story of redemption, understanding, and change, was just beginning to unfold. Tomorrow's meeting between Officer Thompson and Mayor Richardson would set in motion events that would challenge not just their own perspectives, but the very fabric of their community. As night fell on this historic day, neither man could sleep, both wondering how their early morning encounter would reshape not only their own lives but the future of Millbrook itself. The next morning arrived with a thick blanket of fog hanging over Millbrook, matching the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the town. Officer Thompson sat in his car outside City Hall, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had turned white. He was 15 minutes early for his meeting with Mayor Richardson, but he couldn't bring himself to go inside just yet. His phone screen lit up again, another message from his daughter, a junior at the local university. "Dad, we need to talk about what happened," it read. She'd been texting since yesterday, each message more disappointed than the last. Thompson clicked the screen dark, adding her message to the dozens he hadn't answered. Inside City Hall, Mayor Richardson stood at his office window, watching Thompson's patrol car through the fog. His own phone buzzed constantly, national news networks requesting interviews, civil rights organizations offering support, and political allies seeking to capitalize on the incident. He'd declined them all. This wasn't about politics or publicity, this was about something more fundamental. At exactly 9 a.m., a knock echoed through the mayor's office. "Come in, Officer Thompson," Richardson called out, his voice steady and welcoming. Thompson entered, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. His uniform was perfectly pressed, he'd spent an hour on it that morning, trying to restore some sense of dignity. "Please, have a seat," Richardson gestured to a chair not across his desk, but in a small sitting area by the window. It was a subtle choice, one that put them on equal footing rather than maintaining the formal barrier of authority. "Sir, Thompson began, but his rehearsed apology crumbled under the weight of the moment. "Before we begin," Richardson said, "I'd like to show you something." He reached for a framed photograph on his desk and handed it to Thompson. The picture showed a young black boy in a police officer's cap, beaming beside a uniformed officer. "That's me, age 10, with Officer William Hayes. He was the first black police officer in Millbrook." Thompson studied the photograph, noting the pride in both faces. "I knew Bill," he said softly. "He retired my first year on the force. Officer Hayes used to patrol my neighborhood," Richardson continued, settling into his chair. "He'd shoot hoops with us kids, learn our names, know our parents. When I told him I wanted to be a cop like him, he sat me down and had a long talk about what that would mean, the challenges, the responsibility, the importance of seeing people, really seeing them." Thompson's throat tightened. "What made you choose politics instead?" "Life has a way of changing our paths," Richardson replied, a hint of sadness in his smile. "But that dream, of serving and protecting everyone equally, it never left me. It's why I ran for mayor." The conversation shifted, becoming more personal. Richardson shared stories about growing up in Millbrook, about teaching his son how to handle police encounters, about the weight of being the first in so many situations. Thompson, in turn, spoke about his own background, his father's small hardware store, the changes he'd seen in the town over 20 years of policing, and gradually, the biases he was only now beginning to recognize in himself. "You know what scared me most yesterday?" Thompson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not the crowd, not the chief, not even losing my job. It was seeing myself through my daughter's eyes. She's studying social justice at college, and I always dismissed her new ideas about systemic bias. Now." His voice trailed off. Richardson leaned forward. "Fear can be a powerful teacher, Officer Thompson. But so can hope." He stood and walked to his window, gesturing for Thompson to join him. Below, the morning fog had lifted, revealing the town square where people went about their daily lives. "Look out there," Richardson said. "Every person walking by has their own story, their own fears, their own hopes. Our job, yours as an officer, mine as mayor, is to protect and serve all of those stories, not just the ones that look like our own." The conversation continued through the morning, moving beyond the incident to deeper discussions about community policing, about trust, about change. They talked about practical steps, body camera policies, community engagement programs, training reforms, but also about the harder work of changing hearts and minds, starting with their own. As their meeting drew to a close, Thompson stood to leave, feeling both drained and somehow lighter. At the door, he turned back. "Mr. Mayor, about yesterday." Richardson held up his hand. "Yesterday happened. We can't change that. But tomorrow? That's still up to us. Outside City Hall, the sun had broken through completely, casting sharp shadows across the town square. Thompson walked to his car, aware of the looks from passers-by, some curious, others hostile. But for the first time since yesterday morning, he felt something close to hope. Back in his office, Mayor Richardson finally picked up his inauguration photo and hung it on the wall. As he stepped back to check if it was straight, his phone buzzed with another interview request. This time, instead of declining, he paused. Maybe it was time to share this story, not for publicity, but because sometimes, change needs a catalyst, and truth needs a voice. The story of what happened that autumn morning in Millbrook was far from over. But in that quiet office, between two men willing to look past their titles and prejudices, something had shifted. It wasn't the end of racism, or bias, or misunderstanding, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all a community needs to begin healing. The video had reached millions of views by the time Officer Thompson returned to active duty a week later. His first shift back started with a briefing room that fell silent as he entered, colleagues averting their eyes or studying their notepads with sudden intensity. The weight of their judgment felt heavier than his bulletproof vest. Chief Wilson had mandated sensitivity training for the entire department, but Thompson voluntarily signed up for additional community engagement programs. Some officers whispered that he was just trying to save his job, but they hadn't seen him sitting alone in his backyard every night that week, replaying 20 years of interactions through a new lens. His daughter finally came home to talk, bringing with her a stack of books about police reform and racial justice. They sat at their kitchen table, where homework help and family dinners had once been the norm, now navigating much harder lessons. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling but determined, "I need you to really hear this." Meanwhile, Mayor Richardson faced his own challenges. Some community leaders pressed him to demand Thompson's badge, calling his willingness to dialogue a sign of weakness. Others criticized him for playing politics instead of taking stronger action. But Richardson remembered Officer Hayes's words from long ago, "Change happens heart by heart, son. You can force compliance, but you can't force understanding." The mayor's calendar now included regular meetings with both community leaders and police officers. In one such meeting, an elderly black business owner broke down while describing how his grandson was now afraid to drive through Millbrook. Across the table, a veteran officer shared her own fears about sending her kids to school amid growing anti-police sentiment. Thompson's first community patrol since the incident brought him to the local high school. As he walked the hallways, he noticed students filming him with their phones, some making comments under their breath. But then something unexpected happened. The school's basketball coach, a longtime Millbrook resident, approached him. "My players could use another referee for practice," the coach said, gesturing toward the gym. "If you've got time." Thompson hesitated, then followed him in. For the next hour, he ran up and down the court with the team, calling fouls and traveling violations. The students' initial wariness gradually gave way to playful arguments over calls and even some laughter. Back at City Hall, Mayor Richardson was reviewing proposals for a new community oversight board when his secretary announced an unexpected visitor, Officer Thompson's daughter. She entered the office clutching a proposal she'd developed with her university's criminal justice reform group. "Sir," she began, her voice steadied despite her nervousness, "I think there's a way to turn what happened with my father into something positive for Millbrook." As she laid out her ideas for a youth police dialogue program, Richardson noticed she had her father's dedication and her own generation's vision for change. The local newspapers' coverage shifted from sensational headlines about the incident to deeper explorations of community-police relations. They ran a series of interviews with residents sharing their experiences with law enforcement, both positive and negative. Thompson read each one, recognizing some of the names, seeing familiar streets through unfamiliar eyes. One evening, as Thompson patrolled past the community center, he noticed Mayor Richardson's car in the parking lot. Inside, he found the mayor shooting baskets alone, his suit jacket draped over a chair. Without a word, Thompson picked up a stray ball and began shooting at the other end. "You know," Richardson said during a water break, "Officer Hayes used to say that the most important skill in police work isn't marksmanship or physical fitness." He passed the ball to Thompson. "It's the ability to see yourself in others, and others in yourself." Thompson dribbled thoughtfully. "I keep thinking about my first day on the force," he admitted. "How proud I was to put on the badge, how sure I was about everything. Now." He let the ball roll away. "Now I'm not sure about anything except that I need to do better." The mayor retrieved the ball. "That's called growth, Officer Thompson. And it's not comfortable for anyone involved." Their impromptu basketball session was interrupted by a group of teenagers entering the gym for evening practice, the same ones Thompson had refereed for earlier. There was a moment of awkward silence before one of them called out, "Hey Officer T, we need a ref again." "Mayor, you any good at calling travels?" What followed was an hour of basketball that broke down more barriers than any official meeting could have. The teens trash-talked both the mayor and the officer, respect and wariness gradually mixing with normal teenage bravado. Parents arriving to pick up their kids found themselves drawn into conversations in the parking lot, sharing concerns and hopes for their community. As Thompson drove home that night, he passed the spot where he'd stopped Mayor Richardson's SUV. The memory still stung, but now it carried something else too, a sense of possibility. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Dad, the mayor approved my proposal. Will you help me set up the first youth dialogue session?" In his rearview mirror, Thompson could see the community center's lights still glowing. Inside, kids were still playing basketball, parents were still talking, and somewhere in Millbrook, other stories were unfolding, stories of fear and hope, of mistake and redemption, of change that comes slowly but surely, one heart at a time. The road ahead would be long and certainly not straight. But as Thompson typed, "yes," in response to his daughter's message, he realized that maybe, just maybe, what had felt like the worst mistake of his career could become the catalyst for his most important work yet. 2 months after the incident, Millbrook Community Center buzzed with nervous energy as teenagers and police officers filed into the gymnasium for the first youth dialogue session. Thompson stood near the entrance, watching his daughter arrange chairs in a circle. She'd spent weeks planning this moment, determined to transform her father's mistake into meaningful change. The local media had gotten wind of the event, but Mayor Richardson had insisted on keeping it closed to press. "This isn't about publicity," he'd said during the planning meeting. "It's about honest conversation." Now, watching young people enter, some defiant, some anxious, all brave enough to show up, Thompson understood the wisdom of that decision. Among the attendees was a high school senior whose father had been wrongfully arrested 5 years ago. Thompson remembered the incident. He hadn't been involved, but he'd stayed silent when other officers joked about it in the break room. The young man met Thompson's eyes briefly, his expression guarded but not hostile. "All right, everyone," Thompson's daughter called out, her voice stronger than he'd expected. "Let's form our circle." Officers and teenagers reluctantly mixed, leaving the familiar comfort of their separate groups. The basketball coach who'd first invited Thompson to referee stood by, ready to help facilitate. The first hour was uncomfortable. Teenagers shared stories of being followed in stores, of watching their parents get pulled over for minor infractions, of the constant awareness of their skin color. Young officers spoke about their ideals for joining the force, their fears on the job, their struggle to balance safety with fairness. One young officer, barely 5 years on the force, broke down while describing a traffic stop gone wrong. "I was so scared," she admitted. "And I realized later, if I was that scared with a badge and a gun, how must that driver have felt?" Her honesty cracked something open in the room. Suddenly, stories flowed more freely, pain and hope mixing in equal measure. Meanwhile, across town, Mayor Richardson sat in an emergency council meeting. Budget cuts were threatening the very programs he believed could help heal their community. "We can't afford these new initiatives," one council member argued. "The city's finances are already strained." Richardson pulled out his phone and played a video, not of his confrontation with Thompson, but of last week's community basketball game, where officers and teenagers competed while parents cheered from the sidelines. "We can't afford not to change," he countered. "Look at what's already happening." Back at the community center, Thompson's daughter had divided everyone into small groups for role-playing exercises. Thompson found himself paired with the teen whose father had been wrongfully arrested. They were supposed to act out a traffic stop, then switch roles. "You play the officer first," the young man said, his voice challenging. Thompson nodded, feeling the weight of 2 decades of ingrained habits. But as they acted out the scene, he found himself doing something he'd rarely done on actual patrol. He was listening, really listening. When they switched roles, Thompson experienced what thousands of black citizens had felt during his traffic stops: the tension, the careful monitoring of every movement, the constant awareness of how others might perceive you. The exercise left him shaken, but also more determined to change. During the break, Thompson overheard 2 veteran officers talking in the hallway. "This is a waste of time," one grumbled. "We can't do our jobs if we're walking on eggshells." Thompson thought about interrupting, about defending the program, but then he saw his daughter approaching the officers. "Actually," she said, her voice firm but respectful, "research shows that communities where police and citizens have regular, positive interactions have lower crime rates and higher solve rates. Would you like to see the data?" The officers' surprised expressions almost made Thompson laugh. They were seeing what he'd learned over the past 2 months: change often comes from unexpected teachers. As the session wound down, the basketball coach organized an impromptu game. Officers and teens mixed on both teams. The tension that had filled the room earlier dissolved into competitive shouts and laughter. Parents arriving early to pick up their kids stayed to watch, some even joining in. Mayor Richardson slipped in quietly during the game's final minutes, taking a seat beside Thompson. "The council approved the funding," he said softly. "Full program support for the next 3 years." Thompson watched his daughter refereeing the game, confident and compassionate as she called fouls on both sides. "You know," he said, "when I first joined the force, I thought I knew exactly what kind of cop I wanted to be. Turns out I'm just learning now." Later that evening, as Thompson helped stack chairs, the teen from the role-playing exercise approached him. "Officer," he said, hands stuffed in his pockets, "my little brother just got his learner's permit. Could you, maybe talk to him about what to do if he gets pulled over?" Thompson felt the weight of this request, the trust it represented, the responsibility it carried. "I'd be honored," he replied. "And maybe we could work together on a presentation for his whole driver's ed class?" As Thompson left the community center that night, he saw Mayor Richardson still in his office, light glowing through the window. They'd come a long way from that foggy morning 2 months ago, but the real work was just beginning. His phone buzzed, a message in the newly created Officer Youth Group chat, suggesting weekly basketball games. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for mistakes, new chances for growth. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of the parking lot, Thompson felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope, not just for himself, but for his department, his community, and most importantly, for the next generation who wouldn't have to learn these lessons the hard way. Spring arrived in Millbrook, bringing with it unexpected changes. The police department's community engagement program, once viewed with skepticism, had become a model for neighboring towns. News outlets that had once rushed to cover the confrontation between Officer Thompson and Mayor Richardson now returned to document their evolving partnership. On a warm Saturday morning, Thompson pulled into the high school parking lot, where a line of cars already waited. Today marked the launch of a new initiative, a free driver's education program specifically designed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and young drivers of color. The idea had grown from his conversation with that teenage boy months ago. "Officer T," called out a familiar voice. The basketball coach waved from beside a table stacked with handouts. "We've got twice as many people as we expected." Indeed, the school's auditorium was filling up with families, many of whom Thompson now recognized from community center events. Mayor Richardson arrived just as they were about to begin, slipping quietly into a back row. His presence at these events had become regular but never overwhelming, a careful balance of support and space that allowed the community to make these initiatives their own. Thompson's daughter, home from college for the weekend, took the stage first. "When my father and I started talking about creating this program," she began, "we knew it had to be different. Not just about traffic laws, but about real conversations, real experiences, and real solutions." The presentation that followed wasn't what anyone might have expected from a police-run program. Young people shared their fears about driving while black or brown. Parents discussed the painful talks they'd had with their children. Officers, including Thompson, admitted to their own biases and the work they were doing to overcome them. During the break, Thompson overheard two mothers talking. "I never thought I'd see the day," one said, watching her son chatting comfortably with a police officer. "My husband still isn't convinced, but..." She gestured at the scene before them, where barriers that had seemed permanent were slowly dissolving. The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios, with officers and experienced drivers acting out traffic stops while explaining both perspectives. Thompson's role-play partner was the father whose wrongful arrest he'd remembered months ago. Their demonstration, honest about past mistakes and focused on future change, left many in the audience wiping away tears. Later, in the parking lot, Mayor Richardson approached Thompson. "The state police commissioner called," he said, leaning against Thompson's patrol car. "They want to implement our program statewide. They're asking if you'd help train other departments." Thompson watched a young driver practicing parallel parking, an officer providing patient guidance. "5 months ago, I was the department's biggest embarrassment," he said quietly. "Now they want me to train others?" "Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our most important work," Richardson replied. "But that's not why they want you. They want you because you did the harder thing, you admitted your mistakes and worked to change, publicly and honestly." The mayor's words were interrupted by shouts from the practice area. A teenage driver had frozen in panic during a mock traffic stop, triggering what could have been a tense situation. But instead of escalating, the officer calmly stepped back, allowing the teen's father to approach and help calm his son. The crowd watched as what could have been a crisis became a teaching moment for everyone. That evening, Thompson received an unexpected visitor at home, his former partner, who'd retired shortly after the incident with Mayor Richardson. They sat on Thompson's porch, the spring air carrying the scent of blooming flowers. "I watched the video of your training session," his ex-partner said, fiddling with his coffee cup. "Made me think about all the stops we made together, all the times we could have handled things differently." He paused, struggling with words that had waited too long to be said. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up when I saw things going wrong. And I'm proud of what you're doing now." Inside, Thompson's daughter was preparing materials for the next youth dialogue session. Through the window, he could hear her on the phone, passionate about new ideas for community engagement. The conversation drifted to his wife, who had initially struggled with the public attention but now actively participated in community programs. As night fell, Thompson's phone lit up with a message from the basketball coach. The weekly police youth games had evolved into a proper league, with teams mixed between officers, teenagers, and community members. They were planning a championship tournament, with proceeds going to the driver's education program. Mayor Richardson, finishing up late paperwork at City Hall, received his own message, an invitation to be guest referee at the tournament. He smiled, remembering that tense morning that had started it all. Outside his window, patrol cars and civilian vehicles moved through the streets of Millbrook, each interaction between officer and citizen now carrying the potential for either old wounds or new understanding. The next morning would bring new challenges. There were still officers resistant to change, community members harboring deep distrust, and systemic issues that couldn't be solved with basketball games and driver's ed classes. But something fundamental had shifted in Millbrook. In the police station break room, a photo now hung alongside the usual official portraits and department commendations. It showed officers and teenagers mid-game at the community center, Mayor Richardson making a questionable call as referee, and Thompson's daughter capturing the moment on her phone. Below it, someone had written a simple caption: "Change happens one moment at a time." Spring continued to unfold in Millbrook, each day bringing new opportunities for growth, understanding, and the sometimes painful but always necessary work of transformation. The story that had begun with a confrontation in a parking lot had become something larger, a testament to the possibility of change, the power of honest dialogue, and the ongoing journey toward justice and understanding in one small but determined community. 1 year after the incident that changed Millbrook forever, Officer Thompson stood before a packed audience at the State Police Academy. Behind him, a slideshow showed images of community basketball games, driver's education classes, and youth dialogue sessions. But it was the first slide, the body camera footage of his confrontation with Mayor Richardson, that had held everyone's attention. "I'm not here to tell you a success story," Thompson began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm here to tell you about an ongoing journey. One that started with my worst moment as an officer and led to the most important work of my life." In the front row, his daughter sat beside Mayor Richardson, both of them having traveled to support this crucial presentation. The state had invited them to share Millbrook's transformation as a potential model for police reform across multiple jurisdictions. "A year ago, I thought I knew what good policing looked like," Thompson continued. 20 years on the force had given me confidence, but it had also given me blind spots. It took a moment of public shame and personal failure to make me see what I'd been missing. As Thompson spoke, he noticed some officers in the audience shifting uncomfortably, seeing themselves in his story. Others leaned forward, hungry for solutions to challenges they faced in their own communities. The police commissioner, who had initially been skeptical about such a personal approach to training, watched with growing interest. Back in Millbrook, the community center was hosting its own milestone event. The Youth Police Basketball League was celebrating its first anniversary with a special tournament. Teams now included officers and teenagers from neighboring towns, all drawn by the stories they'd heard about Millbrook's transformation. Chief Wilson, watching the games from the sidelines, fielded calls from other police departments wanting to know his secret. He would laugh and tell them, "It's no secret. It's just hard work, honest conversations, and the courage to admit when we're wrong." During a break in his presentation, Thompson checked his phone to find a video message from the basketball coach. The tournament was in full swing, and the coach had panned across the gym to show officers and teams from 3 different towns playing together, their families cheering from the bleachers. "Look what you started," Mayor Richardson said quietly, watching the video over Thompson's shoulder. "When you pulled me over that morning, did you ever imagine this?" Thompson shook his head, remembering the anger and fear that had driven his actions that day. "I imagined my career was over. Instead." He gestured at the academy audience returning from break, many discussing the morning's revelations with newfound openness. The afternoon session focused on practical implementation. Thompson's daughter presented research showing how Millbrook's approach had affected not just community relations, but actual policing outcomes. Crime reporting had increased as trust grew. Traffic stops showed no racial disparity for the first time in department history. Young people were more likely to consider careers in law enforcement. But it was the personal stories that really captured the audience. Thompson shared how his relationship with his daughter had deepened through their work together. Mayor Richardson described how his son, once fearful of police, now helped organize youth events. Officers from Millbrook spoke about the freedom that came with addressing their biases openly instead of hiding them. During the Q&A session, a young officer raised her hand. "This all sounds great," she said, "but what about officer safety? Aren't we putting ourselves at risk by dropping our guard?" Thompson appreciated her honesty. "The opposite is true," he replied. "When communities trust us, when they know us as people and not just uniforms, everyone is safer. My closest backup isn't just other officers anymore, it's the community members who know me, trust me, and want me to succeed." As if to illustrate his point, his phone buzzed with another message from Millbrook. A situation had arisen at the tournament. Two teens from rival schools had gotten into an argument that threatened to escalate. But before any officers had to intervene, other players, both teens and police, had stepped in to mediate, using the conflict resolution skills they'd learned in their dialogue sessions. The police commissioner approached Thompson after the presentation. "I'll be honest," he said, "I thought this would be another feel-good story without practical application. But what you've built in Millbrook, it's real change. How soon can you start training other departments?" That evening, as Thompson drove back to Millbrook with his daughter and the mayor, they passed through communities that could benefit from what they'd learned. Each traffic stop they saw held the potential for either conflict or connection. Each patrol car represented either a threat or a promise, depending on the work they were willing to do. "Dad," his daughter said, scrolling through feedback from the academy presentation, "they want us to develop a full training curriculum. They're talking about implementing this statewide." Thompson thought about the weight of that responsibility. "You know what this means? More scrutiny, more resistance, more chances to fail. More chances to get it right," Mayor Richardson corrected from the back seat. "More opportunities to make real change." As they crossed the Millbrook town line, they could see the lights of the community center still blazing. The championship game would be starting soon. Thompson thought about how far they'd come from that foggy morning a year ago, and how far they still had to go. His phone lit up with one last message, a photo from the basketball coach. The championship teams were lined up, ready to play, wearing special jerseys for the occasion. On the back, where player names usually went, each jersey simply read, "One Community." The sun was setting over Millbrook as they pulled into the community center parking lot, casting long shadows that reminded Thompson of that pivotal morning. But now, instead of fear and confrontation, these shadows held the promise of continued growth, of hard conversations leading to real change, of a future where his grandson and Mayor Richardson's grandson might see each other first as neighbors, then as friends, and only after that as a police officer and a young black man. The work wasn't finished, it never would be. But as Thompson walked into the gym, greeted by cheers from people who had once viewed him with suspicion, he knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was worth the effort. The journey that had begun with his worst mistake had led to his most important mission, proving that change was possible, one heart, one conversation, one community at a time. 18 months after the incident, Millbrook hosted its first statewide conference on community policing. The community center, once just a place for local gatherings, now buzzed with activity as police officers, community leaders, and young activists from across the state filled its renovated halls. Officer Thompson stood in the lobby, watching people arrive. Each face told a story, veteran officers wrestling with change, young recruits eager for a new approach, community members cautiously optimistic about the future. His daughter, now graduated and working full-time on police reform initiatives, directed volunteers with quiet confidence. "Remember when this place was just a gym?" Mayor Richardson appeared beside him, looking sharp despite having just finished a morning radio interview about the conference. "Now look at it, training center, community hub, neutral ground for tough conversations." The morning keynote speech would be their first joint public appearance telling the full story of that autumn morning. They'd told pieces of it before, but never together, never to such a diverse audience. As they waited backstage, Thompson noticed his hands trembling slightly. Nervous? Richardson asked, adjusting his tie. 18 months ago, I couldn't look you in the eye, Thompson replied. Now we're about to tell our story to hundreds of people. Life's strange that way. Their presentation began not with the incident, but with its aftermath, the hard conversations, the small victories, the ongoing challenges. They talked about the driver's education program, now adopted by 15 other cities. They shared statistics showing improved community relations and reduced tension during police encounters. But it was the personal stories that held the audience spellbound. Thompson described how his grandson and Richardson's grandson had become friends through the Youth Basketball League, their innocent friendship embodying the change both men had worked so hard to achieve. During the Q&A session, a young officer from a rural department stood up. This all sounds great for a small town like Millbrook, she said, but what about places with deeper divisions, longer histories of distrust? Richardson stepped forward. Every community's journey will be different, he acknowledged. But the principles remain the same: honesty about the past, courage to change, and willingness to see each other as human beings first. In the afternoon, breakout sessions filled the center's rooms. Thompson's daughter led a workshop on youth police dialogue, while the basketball coach shared how sports had become a bridge between law enforcement and the community. In the main hall, Chief Wilson and community leaders discussed practical steps for implementing similar programs in other cities. Outside, food trucks lined the parking lot, creating an unexpected festival atmosphere. Officers and civilians shared meals at picnic tables, their conversations ranging from policy reform to local sports. The barriers that had once seemed so permanent were slowly, steadily dissolving. Thompson found himself at a table with several young officers from neighboring towns. They asked about his worst calls, expecting stories of dangerous arrests or violent confrontations. Instead, he told them about that morning with Mayor Richardson, how his own prejudices had nearly destroyed both his career and a chance for real change. The hardest moment of my career, he told them, wasn't facing down an armed suspect. It was facing down my own biases, my own mistakes, my own pride. But it was also the most important moment, because it led to all of this. As evening approached, the conference's final event began, a special basketball tournament featuring teams from across the state. Each team was a mix of officers, young people, and community members. The games were competitive but friendly, the kind of environment where connections could form naturally. Mayor Richardson refereed the first game, drawing playful boos from both teams for his questionable calls. Thompson watched from the sidelines, remembering how it all started with one simple invitation to referee a practice game. His phone buzzed, a message from the state police commissioner. Their training program was being considered for national adoption. Other states had heard about Millbrook's transformation and wanted to learn more. What had begun as one officer's worst mistake was becoming a blueprint for change across the country. During halftime, Thompson's daughter gathered everyone for a special presentation. The youth program participants had created a documentary about Millbrook's journey, interviewing everyone from shop owners to school teachers about how the community had changed. The film's final scene showed a recent traffic stop in Millbrook, a young black driver and a white officer. But instead of tension, there was recognition. The driver was one of the basketball league regulars, the officer his teammate. They chatted briefly about their upcoming game before handling the traffic violation professionally and parting with a fist bump. That's what real change looks like, Richardson whispered to Thompson. Not dramatic confrontations, but simple human moments. As the conference wound down, Thompson found himself back in the lobby, this time with his entire family, his wife who had supported him through everything, his daughter who had helped him channel his mistake into meaning, and his grandson who was growing up in a very different Millbrook than the one Thompson had policed for so many years. Mayor Richardson's family joined them, their children playing together while the adults talked about the future. They had received invitations to speak at police academies across the country, requests for program materials from hundreds of departments, and questions from communities facing their own struggles with trust and justice. "You know what I realized?" Thompson said, watching the kids play. "That morning when I stopped you, it wasn't the end of something. It wasn't even the beginning. It was just the moment we both decided to do the harder thing, to choose understanding over anger, growth over shame." Richardson nodded, understanding. "And that's the message we need to share, that it's never too late to make that choice, to do that harder thing." As night fell over Millbrook, the community center slowly emptied, but the energy of the day lingered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for misunderstanding, new chances to either build bridges or burn them. But something fundamental had changed in this small town, a change that was now spreading far beyond its borders. The story that had begun with a confrontation in a parking lot had become something larger, a testament to the possibility of transformation, the power of honest dialogue, and the ongoing journey toward justice and understanding. It wasn't a perfect ending, because there was no ending at all, just the continuous work of building a community where everyone could feel seen, heard, and valued. As Thompson locked up the community center that night, he looked up at the stars above Millbrook, the same stars that had witnessed his worst moment 18 months ago. They now shone down on a different man, a different department, a different town. And somewhere out there, other communities were beginning their own journeys, learning from Millbrook's story that change was possible, one choice, one conversation, one moment at a time.